Whether you say that you hold to a covenant theological framework or are just a faithful Bible reader, the covenants that God makes with humankind matter more than we sometimes think. From first to last, each one universally displays the goodness and the grace and the love of God toward all of humankind. Each covenant shows God condescending to our human need for structure and assurance. He makes these promises to give us hope for the future and implements the law through covenant so that we have some framework by which we can have relationship with Him. God covenants with humankind to address our greatest need, a new heart that is able not to sin. Now, taken individually and artificially separating them, every covenant is important in that each one teaches us something new about God and ourselves. And even if we don't see the relationship from one to the next and on into eternity, they still have immense value as a part of the Scripture. They are worthy of our attention and devotion. In previous episodes, I gave definition to the divine covenants and explored their component parts. As we turn our attention to the individual covenants themselves, we see that not all of them have all these parts. Not all of them, for example, have a sign associated with them. And controversially, not all of them contain the word covenant. That fact alone creates scholarly disagreement about what can be called a covenant in the Bible. All of those topics are worthy of study and could receive an episode all to themselves, but that's a little bit outside of our scope. Understanding the covenants and their relationship to one another enables us to give structure to the grand scope of the biblical story and points us toward our promised eternity, and it's important that we keep this context in mind. So let's look at our first covenant today. I'm Pastor Warren, and this is Walk the Walk. The first place that we encounter the word covenant in the English Bible, that's berit in Hebrew, we find it in the short Genesis narrative about Noah in chapter 9. Here, God makes a promise to Noah and his descendants that he will never destroy all earthly life with a natural disaster ever again. Historically, this was appropriate to assure Noah after he had just seen God destroy everything. God's covenant gives Noah confidence to look forward in history, to see a way for his sons and his grandsons and so on to have life without constantly looking over their shoulders to see if the storm clouds are forming. That this promise is unconditional lends immeasurably to Noah's self-assurance. In addition to that, the promise does not include any conditions that he has to meet to know the blessing. And likewise, there's no failure on his part that will lead to God withdrawing this oath. In the structure of this covenant, we can see the components that we discussed in a previous episode. The first thing that we see in this promise is that God makes it unilaterally. Noah is not asking Yahweh for assurance. God, of his own divine initiative, blesses Noah with the promise. As we noted, there are no conditions for this covenant. Noah and all his descendants, without limit or exception, are assured of God's mercy through the end of his plan for history. There is nothing that Noah can do that will cause God to rescind this promise, and there is nothing that Noah or his descendants can do that will make it more of a blessing. It is given, and it is eternal. The covenant does include something that we didn't touch on in a preceding episode, and that is a sign. Famously, the Noahic covenant is accompanied by the sign of the rainbow in the sky. That sign is a reminder of God's commitment to keeping his oath. Universally, every time we see the rainbow, we're being reminded of God's mercy and goodness, even if we're not even aware of the covenant promise. The simple Noahic covenant is anything but. If we read carefully the story that Moses is telling, the flood, the waters receding on a new world, we see that Noah is being responsible for rekindling the human race. We are seeing a fresh start to the story of humankind. In portraying Noah as he does, Moses is giving us a typology. Noah is shown in these brief chapters as a new type of Adam. Now, you may have heard these literary devices described as types and shadows. The type of Adam is seen again and again, and it takes us back to creation and the garden as God renews life at different points in the unfolding of his plan of redemption. So Noah, as a type of Adam, tells us just that. The world is starting over, but this time with a flaw. The man Noah and his family all have broken hearts beating in their chests. These hearts are tainted by sin. They are only evil all the time. They are hearts that are bent toward sin by default. With that new truth about humanity in mind, the assurance of the rainbow takes on a monumental importance. Despite our fallen condition, no longer do we need to fear the rain or the gathering clouds. This covenantal insight into God's redemptive plan tells us that it is suffused with grace from beginning to end. We let that truth be a lens through which we read Scripture as the plan of redemption unfolds on the pages of the Bible. Watching the plan reveal itself puts the covenants that God makes into a new context and assigns them an importance that we often miss. In our first exposure to the Noahic covenant, our attention is directed to the implied eternal nature of the covenant. That's important by itself, but we also need to be good Bereans and read the promise that God makes in its context. God has already made a promise for the historic course of humankind in Genesis 3:15. He is going to set right what was made wrong in the garden. Keeping that promise in mind is important when we read his assurance to Noah. When God says that he will not destroy all life, it's not a promise of some unending historical era. We read the promise to Noah next to the promise of Genesis 3. And there God is saying that the world is now going to be stable and that he will fulfill the promise of redemption before history comes to a close. Each of the covenants that we read will serve as markers in the historical story. It's important that we keep the narrative in between the covenants in mind in order to properly understand them. Noah's Ark or the rainbow are usually our default memories from the Hebrew scriptures when his name is mentioned. And these acts of merciful preservation and assurance are important. But when our reading expands to the outer edges of the story, its place in the Bible's narrative becomes even more profound. God's promise to redeem creation through the agency of his fallen creatures, each one having a fleshly heart turned to rebellion. Along the way, God is generous in showing fallen human beings a little more of their treasured humanity and the blessedness of their vocation and calling. This becomes motivation for us as we see that he invites us to join him in making its reality known to those who are not yet God's people. Christians can view the Old Testament and its stories as simply stepping stones to get to Jesus. But a good question to ask ourselves is this: did Jesus view the Hebrew scriptures that way? Not exactly. He pointed to the Old Testament stories and covenants as promises that he was fulfilling. A blessing to all the nations, the law that defined our human relations with God, the promise of an eternal throne and a king, a new heart in which the Spirit would reside. These are all covenant promises fulfilled in Jesus, who then points us forward to the rest of the story. Just as God has been faithful to each of these steps in his plan in renewing creation, we Christians can find assurance in the promises revealed in the New Testament. One day, at the end of history, God's plan will conclude and everything will rejoice as the full personhood of humankind is restored and our King comes to dwell intimately with us. The promise to Noah is just the beginning. Thanks for your time and interest in this series. May God richly bless you.